Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name's Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb at AHDB. I'm pleased to tonight's webinar on the beef from Grassland findings, looking at evening is Marc to AS. We'll all stay screens. If you see this box, you might click the on. I'll then ask Marc your question. Marc.
Apologies, I think we just had a few sound issues, but if we hand over to Marc now, we'll sort those sound issues out.
Oh, there
okay,
we go.
thanks, Marc.
Yeah, okay. Right, so thank you very much for letting me talk to you about the Beef from Grass project. I've been working with beef and sheep farmers really probably for the last 7 or 8 years on rotational grazing and getting the most from grass. And we've looked at rotational grazing, but also forage crops to try and reduce the cost of reduction, but more importantly, try and maintain or increase that output. So that's something that farmers don't always realize, that by utilizing grass more, you actually effectively get a little bit more output. So a little bit of back to the project. So it was a 5-year project in total. And really our aim was to try and increase profitability per hectare through 3 key areas. So these were to firstly increase stocking rates across the grazing platform. Secondly, to try and increase growth rates from grazing, but also it was very important that we try and increase growth rates from forage crops like silage as well, because some of the sort of weanling growth rates through the winter are quite abysmal due to the very poor quality silage generally across the UK. And then we're also aiming to reduce the number of days cattle were actually housed. So again, aiming to reduce costs and get cattle and stock out to grass as quickly as possible. The other important side to it as well was the knowledge transfer. So we're having at least 1 meeting on farm each year to try and get the message over to other farmers to develop rotational grazing. And then we also had a little bit of a mentoring scheme involved. So the farmers also had a mentor who were already rotational grazing. So we felt that was quite an effective way of teaching farmers and seeing it for themselves in practical terms, really, of how to get the rotational system set up and running. So in terms of the background to the project, so we initially started with 4 farms. The first one was Cherrington Manor near Newport, next door to Harper Adams. We then had Bragborough Hall near Daventry. And then I was in charge myself of those 2 farms and doing the one-to-one consultancy. We then had Bowden Farms down near Yeovil and Kinsford Farm near Holsworthy. And then consultant Charlie Morgan, or Brass Master that he's known as, was in charge of those 2 farms. Also, we had Karen Wheeler from ADAS, who helped with all the background and the report writing. So she was very useful. So I need to mention Karen for all of her help as well. So once we got those 4 farms, initially we decided to go out to Ireland and actually see the Chuggas demonstration farms and how they were setting their farms up for rotational grazing initially. So we spent 2 days in Ireland, and I think it was a very good practical session for the farmers, just to show the abilities and the setups in terms of electric fencing, water and tracks, and just to discuss with the farmers what they were able or trying to achieve. So initially, when we first started to set up all the farms, me and Charlie went out, and initially we took soil samples across the farm. And this was probably one of the most important parts, because I think probably 40% of farmers across the UK don't soil sample really. So how do they know if they get maximum performance from their soils if the lime, phosphate and potash is very low? So the first thing we did was soil samples, and we got the farmers to try and correct those deficiencies in terms of lime. Lime again is hugely important, because as soon as you drop below pH of 6, 50% of the phosphate locks up. So it's so important to keep those indices high to maintain grass growth. We then went out and walked the farms to assess the grazing and silage areas. It's so important with rotational grazing that we understand where we need to graze, and by that I mean a lot of the farms we worked with had permanent pasture, ridge and furrow ground, wet ground, and of course very steep ground as well. So it wasn't practical to silage those areas. So it was important to set up the rotational grazing on those areas, and then use the flatter fields to take excess grass off, really, to make the system work. So that was another key part of it as well. When we were walking the farms, of course, we were doing sward assessments. So really looking at what that sward contained. So was there ryegrass in that sward, whether there was clover, whether there was a requirement to reseed some of that grass. But also what we were looking for was maybe that 25% or 30% of sown species. So by rotational grazing and grazing quite hard, we felt that we could bring some of those sown species back into the sward as well. So reseeding, you know, it's not for everyone, and you can improve the sward quite significantly by rotational grazing and managing it correctly. And then, you know, we were just looking for a background to the farm, really. So stock numbers, wanted to know exactly how many cattle the farmers were wanting to put into the rotational grazing system. We wanted to know mob sizes. So from a practical point of view, there was no point putting 100, 200 cattle in a mob size if their cattle handling could only deal with 20 or 30 at a time. So we've got to think very practically about the system and what fits in as well. And then, of course, the grazing requirements from their stock and the likely stocking rates going forward. For suckler beef, in the picture there, we've got Cherrington Manor near Newport, and you can see, you know, how effectively they were managing the grassland. Again, swards full of clover, and they were getting very good results in terms of growth rates from the cattle. But overall, our aim really is to try and move those cattle every 2 to 3 days. And really, the reason behind that is just how the grass plant grows, or ryegrass grows particularly. So it's so important that once that sward has been grazed hard over 2 to 3 days, it's important that we move the cattle on. And that's because it takes 2 to 3 days for that ryegrass plant to stick its first shoot up. And again, with inset stocking, that first shoot is nailed time and time again. And again, that delays the potential of that grass to grow. So rotational grazing has to be that 2 to 3 days, particularly when the grass is growing very quickly during May. If we're rotational grazing every 5 to 7 days, I wouldn't really call it rotational grazing. You're losing a lot of the effect that you'd be having from that. Again, we tend to base all the group sizes on the bulling groups. So generally for suckler cows, that would be anything from 35 to 40 cows. But again, you know, if you can run bigger mob sizes, the better. And again, once those bulls are out, you know, can you put 2 bulling groups together, 3 bulling groups together? Size isn't an issue apart from that initial breeding time. Generally, what we decided was 1 hectare paddocks were targeted throughout the system. and that was again capable of the 35 to 40 cows. So again, I suppose going back to old money, we were looking at a 5-acre field being split into 2, and a 10-acre field being split into 4. So that was the basis behind it, really. And that seemed to effectively take that grass cover off in 2 to 3 days. So if you don't think about anything else, just think of 1 hectare paddocks per bulling group, really, and then effectively trying to move them around the farm. Side of it was looking at maps, water, and again paddocks, and how we were actually going to split some of these fields up. So ideally, per bulling group, we'd be aiming for a minimum of 10 paddocks, but again, up to 15 paddocks in total. And the map here you can see in the background is from Bragborough Hall. And again, you can see the red lines are really the permanent electric fencing going in. And then the circles in yellow and blue are water troughs. So some of these water troughs were originally in the fields, and others have been put in. So we've tried to set up the farm initially to take advantage of these water troughs so we can use as many as possible. So the red bright lines are permanent fencing, and then the dashed lines are all flexible short-term fencing as well. So I suppose as the project developed, we initially started with blocks of 10 or 15 hectares, and then the farm just developed out over that period. If you can see right in the very top left-hand corner, there's a perfect site in there of a water trough. So there's a field there, which is the water trough's directly in the middle, and the field's able to be split into 4. So, you know, a 10-acre field, that would be perfect, splitting it into those 4 1-hectare paddock patches. Over the period of the project, again working at Bragborough Hall, they felt that initially for the first year they would divide the paddocks up into 2-hectare paddocks rather than 1, just to see how it developed. And then it became pretty obvious by the end of the grazing season that the fields and paddocks needed splitting down into those 1-hectare paddocks. And that was really due to the cattle being unable to graze down to the bottom of the sward over a 5-day period. And again, performance was dropping off. So if you can imagine, the cows would be on ad-lib feed or grass for 3 days, and then they'd have 2 days of, you know, eating the crap out at the bottom of the sward, really. So the cattle wouldn't be doing quite as well for those last 2 days. We're also finding that a lot of that grass was getting trampled in, and the utilisation dropped down. So that's why it's so important to try and maintain that small paddock size if possible. If that's not possible, it's then trying to expand the mob size. So that's going to be the most simple way of doing it. Utilize outwintering. So many of the farms were doing a little bit of outwintering. It wasn't possible on 2 of the farms because they were heavier farms, but on the 2 lighter farms, we were able to outwinter. So the key part to outwintering is really just that reduction in cost of reduction. So we're probably talking of a 50% cut in cost per head. So particularly for the suckler cows, it worked very well. But for the young stock, we also realized that maybe we weren't quite getting some of the performance we required. So some of the stock might have only been doing 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 of a kilo through the winter period. So it was important that we, as well as reducing those costs of reduction, that we try to actually increase the growth rates of those cattle over that winter period. And that quite often meant feeding less silage and actually more root crops and higher energy root crops. So after 1 or 2 years of outwintering, the 2 farms that were doing it actually swapped to fodder beet. And then we were in a situation where the yield was very, very high, 25 tons of dry matter per hectare. And then this was then leading to an increase in stocking rates across the whole farm. but more importantly, the energy content of fodder beets was 12.5 ME, and we were achieving 0.8 to a kilo a day live weight gain off the young cattle. So again, it had huge benefits for these farms. Again, it was working into arable systems and adding organic matter there as well. So if it can be worked into a system, it can make suckler beef production a lot more profitable. Right, so just looking at some of the figures and some of the main information that we gathered from the project, we've still got 2019 data to come in as yet, so we'd be hoping that that would be higher again. What we'd like to do is just try and monitor the progress of these farms via farm bench for another couple of seasons to really see what the true potential and output of the system is. So really, in terms of live weight per hectare, so this is really one of the key performance indicators for the system. It doesn't really matter what you're doing on the grass-based system, whether it's milk solids, kilos of lamb produced, or kilos of beef. It's all about the amount you're producing per hectare. And that's a very different way of thinking compared to concentrating on the individual animal. So everything we've focused on is per hectare. So over the 4 years, the average live weight per hectare produced on the farms started at about 110 kilos per head, and we managed over the time through the increase in rotational grazing, and again this generally just came from increased stocking rate and utilizing and managing that grass better. We managed to get the live weight up to nearly 400 kilos per hectare. So that was about a 353% increase over the period of the project. And like I mentioned, this was again mostly from that increased stocking rate on the grazing platform. So really, we'd like to try and see those figures up to about 500 kilos per hectare. And again, these were 200-day weights. So these were calves up to that period. And 3 of the 4 farms didn't creep feed, and 1 of the farms did creep feed bull calves because they were then going on to intensive finishing. So generally the figures are non-creep fed cattle. Right, so looking at live weight gain per kilo of head per day, again, we aim to try and increase this really because we felt that if we could get better quality grass in front of the cattle, there would be a higher performance and the calves would be growing at a higher live weight gain throughout the full season. So we didn't actually achieve quite as much as we wanted. We were aiming, I suppose, for a 20% increase, and we got around 7%. But I think the most important thing we realized was that whilst the calves were on the cow, it didn't really matter how poor that grass quality was, because the cattle were actually converting it for the calves into milk. And again, it was, that milk which was achieving those growth rates. So it wasn't really until we were getting into October, November, where that better grass quality would make a big difference for those grazing cattle. The biggest difference we were finding was for silage quality during the winter period. So this isn't taken in the results above in the table, but we were finding some of the farms on very poor silage were only doing probably 0.3 of a kilo through the winter period with no supplement. Well, if they managed to get 11 to 12 ME silage, we could then increase it up to 0.7 of a kilo through that winter period. So again, if they were looking to push those cattle or store cattle through the winter a little bit harder and introduce a little bit of supplement, they were then over a kilo a day with very little extra cost through feeding concentrates. However, this did change dramatically in the second season of grass. From then, the point shifted that grass quality had to be exceptional to achieve 1.2, 1.3 kilos a day gain when those cattle are finishing at grass. The higher the quality, we could be hitting 1.5 to 1.8 kilos a day, but that involved very good management of grass, lots of clover in the system, And again, we've got to be looking at that mid-season dip off in quality of grass when the conditions get too dry. That's when the clover comes in and takes over from the grass and maintains that growth rate through the season. And again, if we're looking at farms which are going into dairy beef, again, from young stock being turned out at 100, 150 kilos, grass quality is everything then. So the suckler cows were able to manage on that permanent pasture and achieve reasonable good daily live weight gains. But for that young stock on their own, again, that quality is key. The other target we had was number of weeks housed. And I think generally average farms are probably 20-25 weeks housed throughout the year. And again, the further west you go, the longer that period is. Because I live in Wales, a lot of farms near us are housing for 7 months of the year. And to be quite honest, you know, that initially makes the suckler cow unworthy and able to make a profit at all. So we're very much looking at the number of weeks housed to try and bring it down. And as an average over that period, we got the farms down from 12 down to 5 weeks in total. 2 of the farms, again, which were housing during the winter, and 2 of the farms, you know, converted virtually over to full out wintering of all stock on farm. But for those farms which were turning out of sheds, it was so important to get fertilizer early on in the year. So we were aiming to target fertilizer from the middle of February. Ideally not putting on a huge amount, maybe 30 kilos a hectare of nitrogen. And again, later fertilizer applications as well were key. So aiming to target the first week or second week in September to boost grass covers going into the winter period. So this was effectively taking off maybe a month at either end of the season. During the season, the farmers could use nitrogen or quite often didn't, depending on the type of ground they were. The higher and faster you want to push, the more nitrogen could be used. For instance, the dairy guys could be going around every 3 weeks, but most of the farms we were dealing with were using fertilizer only once or twice throughout the season. The other key part to that early turnout is rest in the grassland in the winter. So quite a lot of beef farms have sheep as well, and as soon as the cattle come off that grass in late October, early November, and go into the sheds or onto the outwintering, the worst thing that can happen is those little white sheep will go over all of the cattle ground and wipe out that grass cover throughout that season. So effectively that means we've got no grass for the suckler cows until the middle or late April, or even going into May. So really what we're aiming to do with these farms is start the last rotation from the 1st of October, and then ideally that field which was first grazed from the 1st of October would not be grazed then until the middle of February, and that would be the first field grazed, so we'd have the largest cover. So we'd be aiming to carry those covers all the way through the winter and allow us to turn out earlier in the spring, and that did work quite effectively on a few of the farms. Again, we're looking at doing that again for the guys who are out wintering as well. So that's an important side of it, that early and late grass, to effectively make our season longer and cheapen that winter period. And again, the reduction in overheads is the key to this. So again, you've got a nice big shed there. You put in straw, concentrates. Again, you've got a lot of big heavy machinery there, a tractor with a straw chopper, maybe a TMR feeder. So these are the overheads that we're able to try and drop out of this system or reduce. And then I suppose the most important part of it really was the gross margin per hectare. So this is really what we were trying to increase throughout the farm. So effectively, we started at an average in the base year at about £420 per hectare. And then over 2016, 2017, we took it up to nearly £780 per hectare. And then in 2018, we hit the drought. So that had quite a big effect on 3 of the 4 farms. So the one farm was quite heavy and probably had the most grass they'd ever had. But the other 3 farms dried off and basically didn't have any rain from probably late May, early June, all the way through to September. So the gross margin per hectare dropped off quite significantly through that season. And really that was due to a drop in growth rates from the cattle, but also from the purchase of straw and silage and concentrates just to take over those suffer cows during that grazing season. But I think the progress those farms made were quite significant. Again, I think the target really for 2019 is £1,000 per hectare, and judging on the performance I've seen so far, they should achieve that. So again, we'll just have an update in the farm bench results shortly, and hopefully we can get some of that data and see that those farms are hitting those levels. Be very interesting to see exactly how high or how hard we can push with this system before, again, something like a drought or the use of extra nitrogen becomes too costly to take those stocking rates too much higher. I suppose to give you an indication, a lot of the farms were probably very lowly stocked at 0.8 to 1 livestock unit per hectare, and then now they're approaching 1.5 livestock units a hectare. I think we have got the ability to push a little bit higher than that, but again, it depends on the level of stewardship schemes on the farm and the amount of permanent pasture. And again, with summer dry areas, that nitrogen is not going to be effective during that season from June through to early September. So in terms of lessons learned from the project, I think that many of the farms are now at labour capacity. So that's really capped them at around that £1,000 per hectare gross margin stage. Some of the farms are thinking of taking on extra labour, but others are quite happy at the level they are. Of course, the more cows, the more labour they're going to require, but hopefully the system can be managed to make it less labour intensive. The important thing really was that, of course, the cows can effectively convert that poor quality pasture into good growth rates for those calves through milk. So again, a lot of farms do have that poorer permanent pasture, the ridge and furrow, and grass in stewardship schemes. So the suckler cow can be effectively used to try and convert that. And again, that can work very well on farms. Rotational grazing improves grass quality and reduces the weed burden. So after 2 seasons, we've seen noticeable differences in the quality of the grass in those swards. Where the ryegrass and clover hasn't come back, we've asked the farms to try and reseed or oversow those fields. But where it has, there's been no need for reseeding, and the quality of the grass has improved from season to season. And more importantly, just by the better management, it's actually reduced some of the weed burden, especially rushes on some of the heavier farms, because it's actually forcing the cows to eat some of the weeds as well. In terms of measuring the grass and plate metering, we managed to get the farmers to plate meter for the first season / 2 seasons, and then after that we really struggled to get the farmers to measure the grass, because it was an extra 4 or 5 hours a week during their time, and it was something that they felt wasn't really effective. So we were actually putting the information into AgriNet, and this was giving us grass budgets of how much grass they were growing throughout the year. But it was, again, helping in the rotation with flagging if it was going dry or we were running out of grass. It was giving us a 2 to 3 week notice. But the farmers felt that once they've used the plate meter, they got the hang of what 3,000 kilos of dry matter looked like and what the residual of 1,500 kilos looked like. They were quite happy moving the cattle by eye. And to be quite honest, the results spoke for themselves, really. The farmers were still increasing that gross margin per hectare throughout the project, and it did work quite well. The one thing I would say is on the farms which are more intensive, I think the use of a plate meter and those measuring tools is more important, because you'd have less of a buffer if grass ran short. So I think it was important for those more intensive farms to keep plate metering and see how far they need to push. Again, when we're setting up these farm systems, it's so important to be flexible. So having extra paddocks in the system to move cattle to, if you run short of grass, that's key to it. And again, during the dry period, the farmers, would stick in an extra bale or two just to allow the covers going in front of the cows to recover. So it's very important to try and be as flexible as possible to make the system work. And again, we've had horrendous wet conditions as well. So, in the spring, if you turn them out and then it chucks it down and the conditions get bad, again, try and bring those cattle back in, and then they can go back out again. So again, it's all about increasing stocking rate, but also trying to reduce your poaching damage as well. Again, silage tends to be taken more from round bales, and it's very much little and often. So as soon as a grass paddock gets ahead, you may take 1 or 2 paddocks out for grass silage. And again, I suppose the aim would be to try and take it at a higher quality so it could be targeted at those young stock. So a lot of the farms still had their standard 50, 60 acres of first cut silage, which they would do away from the grazing block. But quite often they would also silage maybe 30, 40% of the grazing block as well. And again, coming in with their own mower, cutting that to try and maintain the quality and taking it off very quickly, work very effectively. The most important part really is grassland management. And again, it can improve dramatically as these farmers develop through the project. And we can see from the project that by managing that grassland properly or better, it leads to a higher profitability. So probably most farms probably increased their stocking rates probably by 60% during that period. So again, it was leading to more cattle and an increase in numbers, and we were finding that numbers actually increased fairly slowly throughout the project because the farmers were breeding their own heifers and wouldn't be able to increase the numbers quite as quick as somebody buying in store cattle or finishing cattle, if that makes sense. I think just about it in terms of the project. I think I've done my half an hour, so I look forward to hear some questions again about the practicalities of it and any issues you're having at home. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Apologies for my sound issues earlier. Hopefully you can all hear me now. While I'm waiting for some questions to come up, I'd just like to highlight a new online resource you might be interested in. So we've got a series of web pages on rotational grazing for beef cattle, which Mark has had input into, and it takes you through the basics of rotational grazing right through to feed budgeting, and this can be found on the AHDB website by typing in rotational grazing into the search bar. So Mark, we've got quite a few questions already. So the first question, we've got 2 here. So how do you see outwintering and the impact on nitrate and phosphates on runoff? And where do you see cross compliance and soil health fitting in with outwintering?
I think it's very important really to choose your sites correctly. So again, the further east you're going with lower rainfall areas, I think that's got to be the priority really for the forage crops to start with. Again, choosing your specific site as well is so important. Really, you don't want fields which are too steep or next to watercourses. And again, I'd be looking to target buffer strips, sort of 10 metre, 15 metre buffer strips with long grass all the way around the fields as well. And again, in terms of management, it's a matter of moving cattle on and off if weather conditions deteriorate. And this year, particularly further in the west, it's been very tricky to outwinter and try and maintain that soil in the field. So that's got to be our priority. In terms of the nitrates and phosphates, really, I suppose it's about trying to utilize those for the next crop in the spring as soon as we can. And again, it's part of that rotation. So again, we've got to be thinking of the organic matter build up there and the benefits that's having to the following arable fields and arable crops. But again, the more intensive we are going, we will have to look into the nitrate levels left in that soil and possible leaching out of them as well. So that's something that I don't think we can continually outwinter on fields, the same fields time and time again, but within a rotation, I think we can utilize that nitrogen quite well. And again, with the phosphates and the outwintering, really, if it's part of a rotation, that should be just cycling around the farm and shouldn't be such an issue.
Thanks, Mark. The next question is trampling and less than full utilisation a long-term problem?
Yes. Really, if on your swards, if you're trampling too much grass in, you're effectively stopping the next regrowth coming. You're also causing more of the grass to die underneath the feet, and the energy levels of the grass reduces for the next rotation. So you might start off with 12 ME grass in the spring, and again, if you haven't managed it appropriately or got the right group size or reduced the paddock size to hit that higher level, the grass quality will really drop off. So it's so important to try and maintain that initially. So, other tools to do that, you could look at pre-mowing. That's one tool, and looking to strip graze those cows, or otherwise look to take a nice cut of silage off, a nice short cut of silage, really, to maintain that grass quality.
Thanks, Mark. How do you take into account kilos of live weight per hectare? So do you include the cow, or is it just the growing calf?
Yeah, we've just focused really on the calf weight produced. So again, as soon as those calves are weighed going out, so as soon as they're turned out in the shed, if you can assume, say they're 55, 60 kilos, they're chucked out, and then we take that off and just work out the 200-day weight, or really, I suppose, that weight when they're on the grass outside, if that makes sense. So it doesn't include the cow at all.
Okay, thank you. And what was a typical mature weight of the suckler cows on these farms? And is it easier to manage with smaller cows? So, for example, do smaller cows cause less damage to the rotation in wet weather?
Yeah, a smaller cow is generally a little bit better grazing. Again, the native breeds work quite well. Again, we're trying to reduce that cow size so it's less treading. And again, what we're effectively looking at is more cows per hectare producing more calves or more weight produced per hectare, really. So one big massive cow is a lot less efficient as well. So that's another part of the system that we've seen as we've been going throughout. So I suppose a lot of the cows might be 650 kilos, something like that. But your more continental type can be up to 800, 850 kilo cows, really. So again, that drops your stocking rate. And again, it's harder to get those cows out in the spring and also graze in the autumn.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question here. From the photos, it looks as though the residuals were quite low. Did you trial any rotations with higher residuals and therefore quicker plant recovery?
Generally, I suppose we didn't. Every farm managed it slightly different, so we just set in trying to get the principles going. Again, the photo you would have seen there. Again, those suckler cows could have been moved a little bit earlier to keep that higher residual. But again, as you probably know from the question, the higher the grazing cover, the quicker grass grows. So again, it's if we were looking to finish growing cattle, we'd probably want to leave less of a residual so those cows are growing quicker, if that makes sense. So for suckler cows, we can hit a residual quite hard to get that grass quality, and quite often they can be used as a tool for finishing stock. Again, with the suckler cows, there's no reason why you couldn't have longer grass, which would allow more grass to be grown due to the leaf area, and have a slightly reduced quality of grass, because again, they'd be converting it for the calves. So again, yeah, that is something which could be of benefit.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a comment here that obviously it's been such a wet winter. What has your experience been this winter of cattle that have been outwintered, and how do you try and provide a lying area for the cattle?
Yeah, in the high rainfall areas, it's been very, very hard. So a lot of farms have been bringing the cattle off because it's virtually impossible to try and get a dry lying area because there's constant rain throughout the days. And we particularly found that on our farm. So we were, in some of those heavy storms, we're actually bringing cattle off and housing them and keeping them in yards and things like that, really. A lot of farmers were blowing straw pads onto the fields to give them some kind of lie back. But again, running them back onto permanent pasture didn't really work because they would just plough up another field behind them, really. So I suppose the key to it, and probably this season has shown, again, I know it was horrendous conditions and there's no guarantee it'll happen next year, but I'd be looking for sites further east with a lower rainfall area. And particularly the farms I've been visiting further east have managed, easily in these conditions compared to the farmers in the west.
Thanks, Mark. How much were housing costs reduced as part of the project, please?
Yeah, so I suppose we're looking at a 50% reduction for every day they're out. So if you were, I don't know, very rough figures, if we were talking of £1.80 a day housing, we could be saving 90 pence per day on that housing cost. So for every cow, you're saving about £27 per month, which is 2,700 for 100 cows, if that gives you a rough guide of where we were.
Thanks, Mark. And you've mentioned that silage quality has been a big factor in pushing growth rates. So what did the farmers do to improve their silage quality?
Yeah, well, really the key was just cutting it earlier. So quite often the farmers were leaving it for 8 to 10 weeks, getting a nice big bulky crop, which is fine for a suckler cow, but there was a requirement to target better quality silage for those young stocks. So really we were looking at probably 5 weeks to get 12 ME, 6 weeks to get 11 ME. So the most obvious thing is, as soon as you see a seed head, was going in, cutting the grass as quick as you can to try and maintain that grass quality. But again, some farmers weren't putting enough nitrogen on, so you could get a bigger yield of higher quality by increasing the nitrogen rate. You would also have more protein in the silage. And the other key thing was using fertilizer with sulfur in to, again, increase yield, but also the protein content. So some of these silages could, swap from 10 ME, 12% protein to 11.5, 12 ME and 15, 16% protein. And then the supplements required through the winter are drastically reduced.
Thanks, Mark. And what are your thoughts on rotational grazing for longer with a more mature grass, so perhaps more of a regenerative approach?
I think any type of system can work on any individual farm. So again, if you're looking to build organic matter more in arable lays, I think it can work quite effectively. Again, if you're using those suckler cows, you can maintain those growth rates quite high. My only concern would be maybe with growing or finishing cattle, where you're looking to push them a little bit higher or more quickly, whether the growth rates would be achievable with the longer stemmier grass. And then the other issue would be you'd have to leave very high covers and move the cattle quite quickly for finishing cattle. So the stocking rate would be reduced quite a lot. So there's benefits of it, again, for the suckler cows, but just being a bit wary of the potential growth rates and stocking rates on the overall system as well.
Thanks, Mark. Do you have any advice for after outwintering on kale? How would you sow the next crop? For example, grass, would you plough it or just work down and sow?
Generally, it just depends on the damage from the cattle. So normally you'd expect to plough it to take out that I suppose treading, which could be 6 inches down. I suppose the other effective way of doing it would be to take a subsoiler through it and then break the surface up and then look to drill over the top. But generally, I would prefer on our fields at home to plough afterwards. Again, it reduces any compaction in there, breaks the soil down nicely for new reseed.
Thanks, Mark. And did you trial the benefits of any more diverse lays, such as herbal lays?
Yeah, a couple of the farms, again, in the drier areas or more sandier soils, we're using more herbal lays. So again, the introduction of cocksfoot, more timothy and less ryegrass, but also the use of plantain, chicory, bird's foot trefoil, and again, red clover, white clover, just a few more, I suppose, herbs in there really to try and maintain that grass growth. And again, deeper rooting was the key to it. So the digestibility of these swards seemed to be maintained all the way through those dry periods where ryegrass would actually drop off. So growth rates of the cattle were good. And again, in 2018, I think we probably found a 30 to 40% increase in yield in these herbal lays compared to ryegrass clover swards alone. But again, it's horses for courses really, and generally I would suggest that you need a reasonable area of that type of lay for cattle to be on it throughout the year. I can't see a point of them being on it for a 10 or 15 day period and then coming back to ryegrass, because we have found a little bit of scours going on and off the different herbs and varieties compared to a normal ryegrass mixture. So again, same for lambs, is having a big enough area to rotate all the way around it at least once.
Thank you, Mark. With having so many cattle on a paddock, is muck a problem tainting the grass for the next time?
Inevitably, after you've been around probably 3 to 4 times, there can be quite a bit of muck left there, particularly, sometimes cows will, if you've got fields on a little bit of a slope, they'll sit at the bottom of the bank or at the top. And again, it's quite, they won't tend to graze those areas, even though there always seems to be lots of grass. So there's a couple of different ways of going about it. One of them would be perhaps pre-mowing in front of the cows. And then as bonkers as it sounds, they'll graze every little last bit of grass after it's been mown, even though they don't necessarily do that if they were actually grazing it. The second thing would maybe put a little bit of salt fertilizer down, again, to help the intakes of grass as well. But again, with ryegrass, you would tend to see it going a little bit stalkier middle of the season, and sometimes that pre-mowing can be an effective way of getting that grass quality back as well.
Thanks, Mark. And did you notice an increase in the worm burden as the stocking rates increased?
I don't think the farmers really had much of an impact with cows at foot. But for some of those cattle in the second season, the worm burden did increase. So it's really about trying to manage that. Again, it's a lot simpler if you've got a nice flat farm where you're able to, move your silage fields around and take the odd cut to reduce the worm burden. And again, if you've got a different livestock class like the suckler cows or even sheep, it's worth trying to utilize those to try and swap that worm burden down.
Thank you. And what is your opinion of mob grazing? For example, a 60-day rotation instead of a 21-day rotation in order to improve soil quality and then perhaps hope to keep the cows out for longer?
Yeah, in terms of the different systems, it doesn't really bother me as long as it's working on every individual farm. That's the key thing. My only concern would be the overall stocking rate of the farm. Again, with mob grazing and the use of it in the winter, again, you're trying to trample a thirding and leave it there. So you're increasing the organic matter. And again, your inputs are very minimal, so it's a very, very low cost system. The only thing would be a reduction in the stocking rate of the overall grazing platform, really. So I haven't actually costed out a system to compare like for like, really. But I would expect that because the kilos of meat produced per hectare are a lot lower, again, from some of that grass out wintering, your stocking rates are very low in the winter as well. So that is the slight negative of it. But on the other hand, the suckler cows deal very effectively with that type of system. You're bringing in a lot of organic matter for those arable farms, which are low in organic matter. And again, it can work very well. So, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad thing either.
Thanks, Mark. And what do you think the lowest cost is for outwintering per head per day for, say, an average of a 650 kilo cow?
Generally, most of your forage crops can be 5 to 6 pence per kilo of dry matter. So it generally depends on your soil type, where you are in the country, and what you're able to get hold of. Sometimes stubble turnip ground can be taken very cheaply and can work quite well. The more silage you have to put into the system, the higher your costs are going to be. So, for instance, if you were strip grazing, deferred grazing, and then putting sort of 70% of the diet with silage bales, it's still quite an expensive system. If you're going for more kale or fodder beet, you could reduce the amount of silage into the system. But I'm probably thinking that fodder beet is probably one of the cheapest because the cows are virtually on ad lib fodder beet, and then you'd just be supplementing with 2 kilos of dry matter of straw or silage really to those cows. So you're bringing the overall cost down, and then effectively your stocking rate's higher with something like fodder beet compared to stubble turnips. So you're needing less ground as well. So that would probably be, although it's very expensive to grow, it'd probably be the cheapest crop per kilo of dry matter and the overall diet for that winter period.
Thanks, Mark. And have you got any numbers for total kilos gained on dairy beef at grass per hectare?
We're achieving 950 to 1,000 kilos of live weight per hectare per year at the moment. So that's effectively growing 12 tons of dry matter of grass per hectare, and then outwintering on fodder beet. So again, I think systems where you're housing them would be fairly similar as well. We could probably increase our management more to increase that further. But there's quite a big step up compared to a suckler cow because you're obviously keeping 2 or 3 young stock compared to a suckler cow and calf.
Thanks, Mark. We've got somebody here that says there are issues with over-fat suckler cows. So the mob came in at 80 kilos heavier this year. However, the calves are growing really well. Do you have any comments on that, on controlling your suckler cows condition?
Yeah, I suppose once the management's going to be after weaning in that situation, really when you've got calves at foot, you really want to push that calf growth rate, really. So you're looking for, if they're on good quality grass, the cow is going to get fat during that summer period, but then you've got that winter period to treat it a little bit harsher and you know, cheaply take it through that winter period. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about that increased weight during the season. If the calves are growing well, that's really what we're aiming for. But it's about finding a nice cheap way to feed those cows in the winter, which, you know, you should be able to treat them a lot more harsher.
Thanks, Mark. And for those that did plate metering, what yields were they getting in kilos of dry matter per hectare?
Yeah, they were probably middle of the road, around 7 or 8 tons of dry matter per hectare, with probably the top farm pushing about 12 a hectare. And then after year 3, they tended to stop measuring as they due to the time commitment.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any experience with bale grazing or rolling hay cut from the same field out behind forage crops in outwintering young stock?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Do you have any experience with bale grazing or rolling hay cut from the same field, rolling the hay out behind forage crops in outwintering with young stock?
What I would say is the growth rates through that winter period are generally fairly low. So you're going to be doing about 0.3 of a kilo, 0.4 of a kilo, because of the lack of energy. If it was mostly extended grazing and bales, you're going to, again, if you're using a forage crop there as well, you're probably looking at wanting a higher energy one rather than kale to be pushing growth rates. And if you're looking to roll those bales out, you're probably going to waste 60–70% of that bale. So, you know, if you need 100 bales to go through the winter, you know, you could be up to needing 200 bales to go through the winter. So that's a massive extra cost as well. So although a lot of people don't like utilizing or using ring feeders, you know, rolling them across a field can work quite well. You know, as long as you've got the nice lightweight ones, not the heavy ones. But yeah, it's so important to plan that field of outwintering really before it's sown, so you've got a good idea of what you need to do. And ideally, we don't want a tractor in there at all, if possible.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a question here. Is it possible to fatten animals on a purely forage system with a stocking rate that remains profitable?
Yes, it should be able to. You would tend to need the more native type of cattle to be finished them directly without the use of supplements. But even still, with continental cattle, they can be supplemented for 60 days at grass to get them away. Although your overall finishing period from birth through to finish is going to be slightly longer, again due to the reduced costs of the system, it will leave a good margin at the end of the system.
Thanks, Mark. I've got another question here. Overcoming a flea beetle attack when establishing kale is becoming more problematic. Do you have any tips which may help with this?
No, I'm afraid. Yeah, I think the secret is just watch that crop very closely for those first few weeks. Again, you know, kale tends to be going in at the time of the year when they're most about. So whether you need to look at sowing it earlier or later, maybe to stop that. But really, the only option you've got is spraying it more often, I'm afraid.
Thank you. We've just got a couple of questions left. So this person says, on a 4 to 5 year rotation of lays, would you move from a clover lay, such as Cockle Park, to a herbal lay with a lot of chicory? So they're organic, zero input for growing and finishing beef cattle, 100% grazing, no supplements. And what would you expect growth rates to compare?
Yeah, sorry, was that with suckler cows or finishing cattle?
So growing and finishing cattle.
Right, growing and finishing cattle. Yeah, I think the herbal lay would work well. If you're trying to push 5 years, you would need to put a little bit more grass in that system, so a little bit more cocksfoot, timothy and ryegrass, because you're going to effectively graze out all the herbs after 3 years. The other important point is, because you're looking at those 5-year lays, really to be putting a little bit more clover in, because that's going to really drive the growth of those low input lays. So rather than, I suppose, your standard ryegrass lay would probably have a kilo of clover, you'd be aiming for a kilo and a quarter at least, really, to try and manage that and increase that digestibility through the season.
Thanks, Mark. We've just had a couple more questions, and these will be the final ones. So, how have you found double cropping fodder beet, and do you think a continuous rotation of fodder beet to annual grass and then back to beet and so on would work with modern beet varieties?
I think with the double cropping, we've done it at home because we have a lack of flat ground suitable, which is dry as well. So we aim to double crop. Well, we grow 50 acres a year. We'll put so then if we're double cropping half of it, we've only got 25 acres to reseed, so it's reducing our reseeding area, and then we won't come back for 8 or 9 years, so it does get a good break after that. Again, I would tend to try and increase that rotation to at least every 3 to 4 years, really. Again, the use of if you're splitting a field in two, 50% grass, 50% fodder beets, there's no reason why you can't just swap them from year to year. I mean, 1 year do it and the other year swap it round and then move on to another field after that. That can work quite well. But I'm very aware of a build-up of diseases and herbicide issues in the future, and we're going to get less sprays going forward. So I think in the long run, it's going to be longer rotations rather than shorter rotations.
Thanks, Mark. And the final question, if you're out wintering with bales that aren't wrapped for cows, but you're still using ring feeders, would you bale them with a belt baler to get them tighter and more layers?
I suppose if they are made tighter, there'd be less rain in them, and I suppose they wouldn't be on their ends, would they? So hopefully the rain would run off. So it'd still be just a matter of cutting the netting or the strings off and then rolling the ring feeder along. So it should work effectively.
Thanks, Mark. That's been a really interesting discussion, and thanks very much for your presentation. Thank you to everybody at home for listening. The recording of this webinar will be emailed in the next day or so in case you'd like to recap on anything heard tonight, and it will also be on the AHDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channel should you want to listen to other webinars. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.